The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Miller's hardware store, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Frank Miller, a 68-year-old man with silver hair and weathered hands, stood behind the counter organizing bolts and screws into small containers. His movements were slow but precise, each action deliberate despite the slight tremor in his left hand. The store had been Frank's life for over 30 years. After returning from Vietnam in 1975, he had used his military savings to purchase the small shop on Maple Street. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, with its faded red paint and creaking wooden sign, but inside it was a treasure trove of tools, supplies, and decades of accumulated wisdom about fixing anything that could break. Frank had always taken pride in helping his customers. Whether someone needed a specific screw for an antique door or advice on rewiring a basement, he was there with a patient smile and steady guidance. The younger folks in town often came to him when the big chain stores couldn't help them with their unusual projects. On this particular Tuesday morning, Frank was expecting a delivery of new power tools. His back ached from yesterday's work-moving inventory, but he pushed through the discomfort. At his age, everything seemed to take a little more effort than it used to. His wife Margaret often told him he should consider retiring, but Frank couldn't imagine spending his days sitting idle when there was still work to be done. The bell above the door chimed as the first customer of the day walked in. It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived alone in a small house 2 blocks away. She approached the counter with a worried expression, clutching a broken door handle in her arthritic hands. "Good morning, Frank," she said softly. "I hate to bother you so early, but my front door handle broke last night. I can barely get in and out of my house." Frank examined the handle carefully, turning it over in his hands. It was an old brass piece, probably from the 1940s. The internal mechanism had worn out completely, but Frank knew he had something in the back that would work perfectly. "Don't you worry about this, Mrs. Henderson," Frank said with a reassuring smile. "I've got just the thing for you. Give me a few minutes to find the right replacement parts." As Frank disappeared into the cluttered back room, the bell chimed again. This time, a young man in his early 20s entered the store. Tyler Brooks was new to the neighborhood, having moved from the city just a few months ago. He wore expensive designer clothes and carried himself with the confidence that often comes with youth and privilege. Tyler looked around the store with obvious disdain. Everything seemed old and outdated to him. The wooden shelves were scarred from decades of use, and the inventory appeared to be from another era. He couldn't understand why anyone would shop in a place like this when there was a modern home improvement superstore just 20 minutes away. Mrs. Henderson waited patiently at the counter, occasionally glancing toward the back room where Frank was searching for parts. The silence in the store was broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant sound of Frank moving boxes around. Tyler approached the counter, standing uncomfortably close to Mrs. Henderson. He drummed his fingers impatiently on the worn surface, clearly annoyed by the wait. When Frank finally emerged from the back room carrying a small paper bag, Tyler's frustration had reached its peak. "Finally," Tyler muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How long does it take to find one simple part?" Frank handed the bag to Mrs. Henderson with a gentle smile. "This should fix you right up. The screws are included, and if you need any help installing it, just give me a call." Mrs. Henderson thanked Frank warmly and headed toward the door. As she struggled slightly with the exit, Tyler rolled his eyes dramatically. The moment she was gone, he stepped forward with an aggressive stance. "Look, old man," Tyler said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I need some serious tools, not whatever ancient junk you've got gathering dust in here. Do you even know what a modern power drill looks like, or are you still living in the Stone Age?" Frank remained calm, though something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm sure I can help you find what you need, son. What kind of project are you working on?" Tyler laughed harshly. "Son? Listen, Grandpa, I'm not your son, and I doubt you could help me with anything. I'm building a deck for my new house, something that actually requires skill and modern equipment, not whatever Mickey Mouse repairs you do for the other senior citizens around here." The word stung, but Frank maintained his composure. He had dealt with difficult customers before, though few had been quite so openly disrespectful. "I've built quite a few decks over the years. Maybe I could offer some advice about materials or techniques." "Advice?" Tyler's voice grew louder and more mocking. From someone who probably learned carpentry when they were still using stone hammers? Look around this place. It's like a museum of failure. How do you even stay in business when there are real stores that actually know what they're doing? Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. I stay in business by helping people solve problems and treating them with respect. Something you might want to consider trying sometime. Tyler stepped closer to the counter, his face flushed with anger and arrogance. Respect? You want respect? Then maybe try keeping up with the times instead of running some pathetic operation that belongs in the past. I bet you don't even know how to use half the tools in here anymore. The old veteran stood quietly behind his counter, his hands resting calmly on the worn wood surface. In his mind, he was remembering other young men who had spoken with such confidence, such certainty about their own superiority. Most of them had learned humility eventually, though not always in pleasant ways. Outside, the morning traffic was beginning to pick up as people made their way to work. Neither Frank nor Tyler noticed the dark sedan that had just pulled into the parking space directly in front of the store, or the uniformed figure that emerged from it and began walking purposefully toward the front door. Tyler's voice continued to rise as his verbal assault intensified. The young man seemed to feed off his own anger, growing more aggressive with each passing moment. Frank remained behind the counter, his weathered hand steady despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. You know what your problem is, old man? Tyler sneered, jabbing his finger toward Frank. You're stuck in the past just like this whole pathetic town. People like you are what's wrong with this country. You can't adapt, you can't learn new things, and you're too stubborn to admit when you're obsolete. Frank's military training had taught him patience and discipline. Even as Tyler's insults grew more personal and cutting, the veteran maintained his composure. He had faced far worse situations than this angry young man, though the disrespect still burned in his chest. I understand you're frustrated, Frank said quietly, but there's no need to make this personal. If you'd like to shop somewhere else, I completely understand. Tyler laughed bitterly. Oh, now you're trying to get rid of me? Can't handle a little honest criticism? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Your generation thinks you deserve respect just for being old. But respect has to be earned, Grandpa. The bell above the door remained silent, but neither man noticed the shadow that had appeared outside the large front window. Someone was standing just beyond the glass, listening to every word of the heated exchange. Earned respect? Tyler continued, his voice dripping with contempt. What have you ever done besides run this decrepit little shop? I bet you've never accomplished anything meaningful in your entire life. Just another old guy who peaked in high school and never figured out how to do anything else. Frank's eyes hardened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. You don't know anything about my life, son, and I don't think you'd be interested in learning. You're right about that, Tyler shot back. I'm not interested in your boring old stories about the good old days or whatever fantasy you've created about your past. The world moved on without you, and you're too pathetic to even realize it. The young man's cruel words echoed through the small store. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that his voice could be heard clearly from outside. In his arrogance and self-absorption, Tyler had forgotten that his behavior was being witnessed by more than just his intended target. Look at this place. Tyler gestured wildly around the store. Look at yourself. You're what, 70 years old? Still working because you probably can't afford to retire? That's not admirable, that's just sad. A real man would have built something bigger, something that mattered. Frank's jaw clenched tighter, but decades of self-discipline kept him from responding in kind. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially with people who seemed determined to remain ignorant. Tyler was warming up to his theme now, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his dominance over the older man. I bet you've never even left this little town, have you? Never seen the real world, never done anything that required actual courage or skill. Just stayed here in your safe little bubble, pretending to be important. The irony of Tyler's words was lost on him completely. He continued his verbal barrage, unaware that each accusation revealed more about his own character than about Frank's. His voice grew louder and more aggressive, as if volume could somehow make his arguments more persuasive. You want to know what I think? Tyler leaned across the counter, bringing his face closer to Frank's. I think you're exactly what's wrong with this generation. A bunch of has-beens who think the world owes them something just because they managed to survive to old age. Frank's military bearing remained evident even under this assault. His back stayed straight, his breathing remained controlled, and his eyes never wavered from Tyler's face. The young man mistook this restraint for weakness, which only emboldened him further. No comeback, old man? Can't defend yourself? That's what I thought. You know I'm right. You've wasted your whole life in this dump, and now you're too old and too weak to do anything about it. Must be nice to have such low expectations for yourself. Outside the store, the figure in uniform had moved closer to the window. The morning sun glinted off polished brass buttons and crisp creases in dark fabric. Inside, neither Frank nor Tyler was aware of this observer, though the conversation was clearly audible through the glass. Tyler's assault on Frank's character was reaching a crescendo. The young man seemed drunk on his own perceived power, intoxicated by what he saw as his complete domination of an helpless old man. His words became increasingly cruel and personal. I bet everyone in this town just tolerates you out of pity, Tyler continued relentlessly. They probably all go to the big stores for their real shopping and only come here when they need something small and worthless. Just like you. Frank's hands remained flat on the counter, though the knuckles had begun to whiten slightly. His military training was being tested in a way it hadn't been for decades. The discipline that had once kept him alive in hostile territory was now being used to maintain his dignity in the face of unprovoked cruelty. You're nothing special, Tyler declared with finality. Just another old guy who never did anything important with his life. And the sooner people like you get out of the way, the better off everyone will be. The words hung in the air like poison, their venom seeming to contaminate the very atmosphere of the small store. Frank stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, while Tyler basked in what he believed was his complete victory over a defenseless opponent. Neither man heard the soft footsteps approaching the front door. Tyler was still savoring what he believed was his complete humiliation of the old store owner, when the bell above the door chimed with a sharp, clear note that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Both men turned toward the sound, though their reactions couldn't have been more different. Frank's expression immediately shifted from restrained patience to something approaching relief, while Tyler's confident smirk faltered as he took in the figure now standing in the doorway. A man in military dress uniform filled the entrance, his bearing unmistakably that of a career soldier. The uniform was crisp and perfectly fitted, with rows of ribbons decorating his chest and polished brass gleaming in the morning light. Colonel James Morrison stepped into the store with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. His eyes quickly assessed the situation, taking in Tyler's aggressive posture and Frank's controlled stance behind the counter. The officer's weathered face showed no emotion, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made Tyler instinctively step back. "Good morning," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of military service. His eyes moved from Tyler to Frank, and something in his expression suggested he had heard more of the previous conversation than either civilian might have expected. Tyler's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to process this unexpected development. The confident young man who had been so eloquent in his cruelty just moments before now found himself speechless. Something about the officer's presence seemed to shrink Tyler's importance in the room, reducing him from a dominant force to an insignificant bystander. "I'm looking for Frank Miller," Colonel Morrison continued, his gaze settling on the man behind the counter. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Frank nodded slowly, though his expression showed confusion. "I'm Frank Miller. How can I help you, Colonel?" The officer's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Miller, I'm Colonel Morrison from the Pentagon. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks regarding some paperwork that requires your attention. When my calls went unanswered, I decided to handle this matter in person." Tyler found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Pentagon?" Colonel Morrison's eyes flicked toward Tyler with the kind of cold assessment that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "I'm sorry, were you part of this conversation?" "No, sir," Tyler stammered, the word "sir" emerging automatically despite his earlier bravado. I didn't." "Then perhaps you could give us some privacy," the colonel suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion at all. Tyler nodded frantically and began backing toward the door, but Colonel Morrison's next words stopped him in his tracks. "Actually, on second thought, please stay. I think you might find this conversation educational." Frank looked increasingly puzzled. "Colonel, I'm not sure what kind of paperwork you're referring to. I haven't had any contact with the military in decades." Colonel Morrison reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a manila folder. Mr. Miller, according to our records, you served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1975. Is that correct? Yes, sir, that's correct. And during that time you were awarded several commendations that were never properly processed through military channels. There seems to have been some administrative confusion following your discharge. Frank's brow furrowed. I'm sorry, Colonel, but I think there's been some mistake. I never received any special recognition. I was just a regular soldier doing my job. The Colonel opened the folder and began reading from the top document. Sergeant First Class Franklin James Miller, awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. Awarded the Bronze Star with V device for heroic achievement in ground operations. Tyler's face had gone completely white. Each word from the Colonel seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and he found himself gripping the edge of a nearby shelf for support. There must be some mistake, Frank repeated, though his voice had grown quieter. I never heard anything about awards. Colonel Morrison looked up from the papers. Mr. Miller, on March 15, 1973, you single-handedly held off an enemy assault on Firebase Charlie for over 6 hours after your position was overrun. You saved the lives of 12 wounded soldiers by providing covering fire while they were evacuated. Do you remember that day? Frank's face had gone pale, and his hands trembled slightly as memories he had tried to bury for decades suddenly surfaced. Charlie Company was my unit, yes, but I was just doing what anyone would have done. According to these witness statements, the Colonel continued, you continued fighting despite being wounded yourself. You refused evacuation until every other soldier was safely removed from the area. Your actions that day prevented what could have been a massacre. Tyler felt sick to his stomach. Every cruel word he had spoken in the last hour seemed to echo in his mind with devastating clarity. He had called this man worthless, accused him of never doing anything meaningful, suggested he was a coward who had never left his safe little town. The paperwork for these awards was lost in the confusion following the war. Colonel Morrison explained, it's taken our historians years to piece together what happened and identify the soldiers whose heroism went unrecognized. Mr. Miller, the United States Army owes you a formal apology for this oversight. Frank stood frozen behind his counter, overwhelmed by emotions he had suppressed for half a century. The young soldier he had once been seemed like a different person, someone whose courage and sacrifice had been forgotten by everyone, including himself. Tyler wanted desperately to disappear, to somehow undo the last hour of his life. He had humiliated himself in the most complete way possible, revealing his own ignorance and arrogance to a genuine war hero. The worst part was that Frank had never once defended himself or mentioned his service, even when faced with Tyler's most vicious attacks. Colonel Morrison's voice brought both men back to the present. Mr. Miller, it would be my honor to present these medals to you in a proper ceremony. You've waited far too long for the recognition you earned. The silence that followed Colonel Morrison's offer was deafening. Frank stared at the documents in the officer's hands as if they were written in a foreign language he couldn't quite understand. The awards and recognition he had never expected, never even dreamed possible, were suddenly being offered to him 50 years after the fact. Tyler remained frozen by the shelf, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Every muscle in his body seemed to have turned to lead, and he found it difficult even to breathe properly. The magnitude of his mistake was slowly sinking in, each detail of his verbal assault replaying in his mind with crystal clarity. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Colonel, Frank finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, but that was also long ago. I'm not the same person I was back then. Colonel Morrison studied Frank's face carefully. Mr. Miller, heroism doesn't have an expiration date. What you did in Vietnam saved lives. Those 12 soldiers you protected went home to their families because of your actions. Some of them are grandfathers now. Frank's eyes glistened with unshed tears as decades of buried memories began to surface. He remembered the faces of those young men, remembered their fear and his own as enemy fire rained down on their position. He remembered making the conscious decision to stay behind, knowing it might cost him his life. Charlie Henderson was one of those soldiers. Colonel Morrison continued softly. He was 19 years old when you saved his life. He went on to become a teacher, raised 4 children, and has been trying to find you for 30 years to thank you properly. The name hit Frank like a thunderbolt. Charlie Henderson had been the youngest member of their unit, barely out of high school when he arrived in Vietnam. Frank remembered carrying the wounded boy to the evacuation point while bullets whizzed overhead. Tyler felt like he was shrinking with each revelation. The man he had mocked and belittled had risked everything to save the lives of strangers. While Tyler had been boasting about building a deck, Frank had been remembering friends who never came home from war. There's something else. Mr. Miller, Colonel Morrison said, reaching into his folder again. Charlie Henderson isn't the only one who's been looking for you. We've received letters from families of the men you saved, all wanting to express their gratitude. They've been wondering for decades what happened to the soldier who gave them their fathers and brothers back. Frank gripped the edge of the counter, his composure finally beginning to crack. The weight of recognition he had never sought was overwhelming. But it was the thought of those families that truly broke through his defenses. One more thing, the colonel added, his voice gentle but firm. Your unit commander recommended you for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was lost in the bureaucratic chaos after the war ended. While we can't award that medal posthumously without the original documentation, everything else is here and verified. Tyler realized that tears were streaming down his face. He had called this decorated war hero a failure, accused him of never accomplishing anything meaningful. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical pain in his chest. Frank looked up at Colonel Morrison with eyes that held both gratitude and sorrow. Colonel, I need you to understand something. I lost a lot of friends in that war. Good men who deserved to come home more than I did. If I'm getting recognition for that day, then their sacrifice needs to be remembered too. Of course, Mr. Miller. That's exactly why we're doing this. Your story is their story too. Frank nodded slowly, then his gaze shifted to Tyler, who was still standing motionless by the shelf. The young man looked absolutely devastated, his face a mixture of shame, regret, and something approaching horror. Son, Frank said quietly, addressing Tyler directly for the first time since the colonel's arrival. You look like you could use some fresh air. Tyler wanted to run to escape the unbearable weight of his own behavior, but something in Frank's tone stopped him. There was no anger in the old veteran's voice, no desire for revenge or humiliation. If anything, there was concern. I'm sorry, Tyler whispered, the words barely audible. I'm so sorry. Colonel Morrison had been watching this exchange with professional interest. As a career military officer, he had seen many different types of people under stress, and he recognized genuine remorse when he saw it. Mr. Miller, the colonel said, would you prefer to have this ceremony at the store, or would you like to come to the base? We can arrange either option. Frank thought for a moment, glancing around his small shop with its worn floors and cluttered shelves. This place had been his refuge for 30 years, his way of serving his community in peacetime. The idea of having a military ceremony here seemed somehow appropriate. Here would be fine if it's not too much trouble, Frank said. This is my home now. No trouble at all. I'll coordinate with my staff and we'll set something up for next week. Tyler finally found his voice again, though it shook with emotion. Mr. Miller, I need to apologize. I need to explain. Frank held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Son, we all make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, it's whether they're willing to get back up and do better. The kindness in Frank's response only made Tyler feel worse. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, every reason to humiliate Tyler in return, and instead he was offering understanding and forgiveness. Colonel Morrison gathered his papers and prepared to leave. Mr. Miller, I'll be in touch with the details about the ceremony, and thank you for your service, even if that thanks is long overdue. As the colonel headed toward the door, he paused next to Tyler. Young man, you've witnessed something important here today. I hope you'll remember it. Tyler nodded, unable to trust his voice to respond coherently. The bell chimed as Colonel Morrison left the store, leaving Frank and Tyler alone together in an atmosphere that had been completely transformed from just minutes earlier. The silence that followed Colonel Morrison's departure was heavy with unspoken emotions. Frank stood behind his counter, still processing the reality of what had just occurred, while Tyler remained frozen by the shelf, wrestling with shame so profound it felt like it might crush him. Tyler's hands shook as he tried to comprehend the full weight of his actions. Every insult he had hurled at Frank now echoed in his mind with devastating clarity. He had called a war hero worthless, accused a decorated veteran of never doing anything meaningful with his life. The irony was so complete, so devastating, that Tyler felt physically ill. Frank moved slowly from behind the counter, his steps deliberate but somehow heavier than they had been an hour earlier. The revelation of his forgotten medals had awakened memories he had spent decades trying to suppress. Images of young faces, some of whom never made it home, flickered through his consciousness like scenes from a half-remembered dream. "Mr. Miller," Tyler began, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know how to apologize for what I said. There's no excuse for my behavior." Frank studied the young man carefully. Tyler's earlier arrogance had been completely stripped away, replaced by genuine anguish and remorse. The transformation was so complete that Frank almost felt sorry for him. "Tyler," Frank said quietly, having somehow remembered the young man's name despite the chaos of the morning. "Why don't you sit down for a minute?" Tyler looked around desperately as if seeking escape, but eventually sank into an old wooden chair near the front of the store. His designer clothes seemed out of place in the humble surroundings, a reminder of the superficial values that had driven his earlier behavior. Frank pulled up another chair and sat down across from Tyler, creating an atmosphere more like a counseling session than a confrontation. The older man's military bearing was still evident, but it was tempered now by something approaching grandfatherly concern. "Son, I want you to understand something," Frank said, his voice calm but serious. "What happened here today isn't really about me or my service record. It's about how we treat each other as human beings." Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to compose himself enough to respond coherently. "I was so horrible to you. I said things that I don't even know where that came from." Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Tyler with the same patient attention he might give to a broken tool that needed repair. "In my experience, people usually lash out like that when they're dealing with their own pain or insecurity." "What's really going on with you, Tyler?" The question caught Tyler off guard. He had expected anger, recrimination, perhaps even a lecture about respect for elders. Instead, Frank was offering him genuine concern and an opportunity to explain himself. "I don't know," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I moved here from the city a few months ago. Everything feels different, slower. I guess I've been frustrated and I took it out on you." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Change is hard, especially when you're young and feel like you should have everything figured out. But that's no excuse for cruelty, and I think you know that." Tyler's head dropped into his hands. "I called you pathetic. I said you'd never done anything important. God, what kind of person does that make me?" "It makes you human," Frank replied simply. "We all have moments we're not proud of. The question is what you do with the lesson." For several minutes they sat in companionable silence. The morning sun had shifted position, casting different patterns of light across the store's interior. Outside, life in the small town continued its gentle pace, unaware of the profound transformation taking place inside Miller's hardware store. Tyler finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than they had been all morning. "Mr. Miller, can you tell me about the war? About what really happened that day?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether to open doors that had been closed for decades. Finally, he began to speak, his voice soft but steady. "March 15th, 1973. We were supposed to be relieved that morning, but the enemy hit us just before dawn. They overran our perimeter in the first assault." Frank's eyes grew distant as he recalled details he had tried to forget. "Most of my unit was wounded in the first few minutes. The evacuation helicopter was coming, but someone needed to provide cover fire." Tyler listened intently, hanging on every word. The contrast between Frank's quiet heroism and his own petty complaints about building a deck was almost too much to bear. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," Frank continued. "I was just trying to get my friends home alive. Charlie Henderson was bleeding pretty badly, and there were others who couldn't move on their own. Somebody had to stay behind and hold the position until the chopper could get them out." "How long did you hold them off?" Tyler asked. "About 6 hours. Seemed like 6 days at the time." Frank's hands unconsciously moved to his left shoulder, where an old wound still ached on rainy days. "I took some shrapnel, but nothing that wouldn't heal. The important thing was that everyone got out alive." Tyler shook his head in amazement. 6 hours. Against how many enemy soldiers?" "That's not important," Frank said firmly. "What's important is that 12 young men got to go home to their families. That's the only thing that ever mattered about that day." The humility in Frank's response was the final blow to Tyler's remaining defenses. Here was a man who had risked everything for others, who had spent 50 years downplaying his own heroism, and Tyler had attacked him for being ordinary. "Mr. Miller, I want to make this right somehow," Tyler said urgently. "I want to help with the ceremony or help fix up the store or anything else you need. Please let me do something." Frank smiled for the first time since Tyler had entered the store that morning. It was a gentle expression, free of judgment or malice. "Tyler, the best thing you can do is learn from this experience and treat the next person you meet with kindness. That's how we honor the sacrifices of the past." The wisdom in Frank's words settled over Tyler like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a clear direction, a way to channel his frustration into something positive. "There is one thing you could help me with," Frank added thoughtfully. "Mrs. Henderson is going to need that door handle installed, and my back isn't what it used to be. If you're really interested in learning some practical skills, maybe you could give me a hand with house calls like that." Tyler's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Yes, absolutely. I would love to help." Frank stood up and extended his hand toward Tyler. "Then let's get started." 3 weeks later, Miller's hardware store had been transformed into something resembling a military reception hall. Red, white, and blue bunting hung from the ceiling beams, and dozens of folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing a small platform that Tyler and Frank had built together. The worn wooden floors had been polished to a shine, and every tool and piece of inventory had been organized with military precision. Frank stood near the back of the store, wearing his old dress uniform that Margaret had carefully altered to accommodate the changes that 50 years had brought to his frame. The Silver Star, Purple Heart, and Bronze Star gleamed on his chest, finally where they belonged after decades of bureaucratic oversight. Tyler was busy adjusting the microphone system he had borrowed from his former company, ensuring that everyone in the packed store would be able to hear the ceremony clearly. The young man had thrown himself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that had surprised even Frank. Every detail had been planned and executed with care, from the professional photographer to the refreshments that would follow the official proceedings. Colonel Morrison stood at attention near the makeshift platform, flanked by 2 other officers who had driven down from the Pentagon specifically for this event. The presence of high-ranking military officials in the small town had generated considerable excitement, and it seemed like half the community had squeezed into the store for the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Next to her was Charlie Henderson, now a gray-haired man in his 70s who had flown in from Arizona the moment he learned about the ceremony. The two weren't related despite sharing a surname, but they had bonded over their connection to Frank's kindness. "Nervous?" Tyler asked quietly as he approached Frank near the back of the store. Frank adjusted his tie and smiled. "A little. I never was much for public speaking." Tyler had spent the last 3 weeks working alongside Frank, learning not just about hardware and home repairs, but about patience, humility, and genuine service to others. The transformation in the young man was remarkable, noticed by everyone who knew him. "You'll do fine," Tyler assured him. "These people are here because they respect what you've done, both in the war and in this community." The ceremony began with Colonel Morrison calling the assembled crowd to attention. As Frank made his way to the platform, supported by Tyler's steady presence beside him, the audience rose as one in a show of respect that brought tears to many eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the small space, "we are gathered today to correct a 50-year-old oversight and honor a man whose heroism saved lives and embodied the finest traditions of military service." The colonel read the citations for each medal. Frank's mind drifted back to that chaotic day in Vietnam. But instead of the fear and confusion he usually remembered, today he found himself thinking about the faces of the young soldiers he had helped save. Charlie Henderson was here, alive and well, surrounded by the family he might never have had without Frank's sacrifice. Tyler watched from the side as Frank accepted each medal with quiet dignity. The young man still struggled with the memory of his verbal assault on this genuine hero, but Frank's forgiveness and guidance had helped him channel that shame into something positive. When it came time for Frank to speak, he approached the microphone with the same steady composure he had shown throughout his life. The store fell completely silent, waiting for his words. "I want to thank Colonel Morrison and the Army for this honor," Frank began, his voice strong despite his age. "But I need everyone here to understand that these medals don't belong to me alone. They represent the sacrifice of every soldier who served in Vietnam, especially those who didn't make it home. Frank paused, gathering his thoughts and his emotions before continuing. I also want to thank my community for supporting me all these years. This store has been my way of continuing to serve, and knowing that I've been able to help my neighbors has meant more to me than any medal ever could. Tyler felt his throat tighten as Frank's words washed over the crowd. The humility and grace of this man continued to amaze him, even after working closely with him for 3 weeks. Finally, Frank said, his eyes finding Tyler in the crowd, I want to talk about second chances. We all make mistakes, we all have moments we're not proud of. But what defines us isn't our failures, it's what we do after we fall down. I've seen remarkable growth in someone very special to me recently, and it's reminded me that every day is an opportunity to be better than we were yesterday. Tyler wiped his eyes as Frank's words hit home. The old veteran was still teaching him lessons, still showing him what real character looked like. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to mingle, Charlie Henderson made his way over to Frank. The two men embraced with the fierce emotion of soldiers who had shared life and death experiences. Frank, I've been waiting 50 years to say this properly, Charlie said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for bringing me home. The reunion between the two veterans drew attention from throughout the store. Other community members approached Frank to share their own stories of how his quiet kindness had touched their lives over the years. Mrs. Henderson told everyone about the door handle installation that Tyler and Frank had completed together, praising both men for their patience and skill. Tyler found himself surrounded by townspeople who wanted to thank him for his role in organizing the ceremony. The recognition felt good, but what meant more to him was seeing Frank finally receive the honor he deserved. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Frank and Tyler found themselves alone in the store, cleaning up the remnants of the celebration. The medals sat in their presentation case on the counter, catching the light from the afternoon sun. Tyler, Frank said as they folded up the last of the chairs, I want you to know how proud I am of the man you've become these past few weeks. Tyler stopped what he was doing and looked at Frank seriously. Mr. Miller, you saved my life too. Not the same way you saved those soldiers, but you saved me from becoming someone I couldn't live with. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Son, I think we saved each other. As the sun set over the small town, casting long shadows through the windows of Miller's hardware store, two men from different generations continued their work together. The lessons learned and the bonds formed in the aftermath of cruelty and revelation had created something stronger than either could have imagined. The medals on the counter served as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that it's never too late for recognition, forgiveness, or redemption. In the end, the ceremony had honored not just Frank's military service, but the ongoing battle that all people fight to treat each other with dignity and respect. Tyler looked around the store that had become his second home and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve the community. And he would face them alongside a genuine hero who had taught him that true strength comes not from tearing others down, but from building them up.